Hallo, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our talk today. Under2, a story of California and Baden-Württemberg in global climate leadership. Let's check real quick if YouTube is responding. Yes, it is. Hello, YouTube. Hello, everybody who's watching through the live stream. My name is Micha Himpel. I'm the Culture Program Manager here at the German-American Institute in Tübingen, and I want to welcome everyone watching tonight. Eureka, Ländle meets California is the series title, and our talk tonight is called Under2, a story of California and Baden-Württemberg in global climate leadership. First of all, I want to thank the German-American Center in Stuttgart and especially Marion Danzeisen for the organization of the series, as well as the State Ministry of Baden-Württemberg for the generous support and for making every single event of this series possible. Not to forget our cooperation partners, the German-American Institute in Heidelberg and the Karl-Schurz-Haus in Freiburg. Eureka, Ländle meets California is a digital event series on the sister state partnership between Baden-Württemberg and California. In monthly events, this series explores what our two states have in common, what we can learn from each other, and how we can work together more closely. If you want to know more about the whole event series, please find a link below in the description section under the video. And so far as I can tell you now, the next talk is going to be hosted by the German-American Institute in Heidelberg in February about universities and the higher education in both states. And if you want to find out more about us, the German-American Institute in Tübingen, please feel free to browse our website, follow us on social media, or sign into our weekly newsletter. All of the links you need to know, you have to click on it, please, in the descriptions below as well. I just want to give you two short event tips from our side, what might be interesting for you. Next week, we'll analyze Joe Biden's inauguration with Tyson Barker and Wiebke Wartenberg on Thursday, January 21st, same time, 7:15 p.m., live via Zoom and YouTube with the title It's Joe Time, die Zukunft der transatlantischen Beziehungen. And the following week, on Tuesday, January 26th at 4 p.m., we're happy to present you the former Foreign Minister of Germany and head of the Atlantikbrücke e.V., Sigmar Gabriel, together with the founder of the initiative Junge Transatlantiker, Jakob Schroth. Are we still friends? Die deutsch-amerikanische Freundschaft auf dem Prüfstand. But now, let's get back to our event today. The Eureka event series kickoff event in December from the German-American Center in Stuttgart was a success. States of Sun and Stars via Inspiration Matters with German hip-hop legend Max Herre and some fellow hip-hoppers from San Francisco. And today we'll continue with our talk about the Under2 coalition and California as a green state. I am happy to welcome Professor Dr. David Biggs from the University of California, Riverside, as well as Mr. Tobias Eisele from the Ministry of Environment, Climate and Energy of Baden-Württemberg. In the beginning, Professor Biggs will start his talk on California as a green state, and Mr. Eisele will follow by giving us a deeper insight into the global climate collaboration between California and Baden-Württemberg. Before we start, I would love to introduce both experts to you, and I'm going to start with Tobias Eisele. Mr. Eisele is a senior counselor in the Ministry for the Environment, Climate and Energy of Baden-Württemberg. He studied law at the universities of Passau, Lausanne and Freiburg im Breisgau, with a focus on European, English, and comparative civil law. He completed his legal clerkship in Berlin and Chicago. Since November 1990, he has been employed in the State Service of Baden-Württemberg. From 1992 to 1995, and again from May 2011, Mr. Eisele was Deputy Head of Unit in the Europe and International Cooperation Department. There, he was responsible for legal issues of European law, for the cross-border cooperation with France and Switzerland, the a cooperation with partner regions such as the Foreign Motors of Europe, as well as the coordination of the Under2 coalition. Since February 1st, 2019, he has been head of EU policy and funding, international affairs, and the Under2 coalition unit. Welcome, Mr. Eisele. I'm glad you're here with us today. Professor Dr. David Biggs, I'm happy to welcome him back at the d.a.i. His first talk he gave in 2017 here at the d.a.i. Tübingen, and we're more than happy to have him back. He's going to talk about the climate impact on California and how California became a green state. After receiving his BA at the University of North Carolina, David Biggs moved to Vietnam and became a volunteer English teacher. He developed an affinity for Vietnamese and generally Asian cultures and studied Vietnam's environmental history at the University of Washington, where he received his MA in 1998. During his studies, he received numerous grants and awards, just to name a few. In 2011, he got a Fulbright Scholarship Vietnam. In 2012, the George Perkins Marsh Prize. Between 2010 and 2013, the UC Pac Rim Initiative Grant. In 2017, he was Rachel Carson Fellow at the Rachel Carson Center at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. And in 2011, his dissertation and first book was published, in which he examined social and environmental dimensions of water control in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. Recently, he has commenced working on a global environmental history of the 20th century called The Acceleration. In short, David Biggs is an environmental historian and a professor of history at the University of California at Riverside. His teaching and research focus on global environmental history, militarization, and environmentalism, and the history of environmental policies, both locally in California and abroad. Welcome, David, and so much from me. I wish everybody a good talk. We'll hear David first and then Mr. Eisele, and then we're going to take questions from all of you, so please feel free to write either in Zoom or into the YouTube link. Thank you very much. I hand over to David.
Thank you very much, Mika. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, and very nice as well to meet Councillor Tobias Eisele. And I'm honored again to visit Tübingen and to give a brief talk. And I really love this format of putting an historian, someone talking about, bringing back stories from the past and relating it to policy with a professional policy analyst in Baden-Württemberg, because a lot of my work is inspired by my background as an environmental activist when I was young. And even though I'm a professor and teaching and studying history, I still really consider a lot of my work to be connected to these ongoing issues, such as sea level change and climate change. So today I'm going to spend about 20 minutes, maybe 25, giving you a brief background about California and how California became a so-called green state in the United States relative to the United States. And it didn't really begin that way. It's something that happened as a unique factor of California's geography. But before I do that, I thought I'd just like to show you what I'm looking at today and where I am. Zoom has a very discombobulating effect, I think, on these talks. And this is a view from my office at the University of California, Riverside. We're east of LA, about an hour. And what you're looking at in the landscape here, when I first moved here, it was called UCR. I thought it was UC Roadside because of this freeway. This is the Interstate 215 freeway. And this is a COVID level, pandemic level traffic. You see a lot of trucks. We're the major logistics hub for the United States and much of North America. which is bringing a lot of debates with Amazon logistics and how these communities in the inland area can develop. But there are some signs of hope. We have a solar farm on our campus. We are also a major agricultural school with orange groves, as well as a garden that's established to provide food to students, especially students who are challenged to find enough food. So there's some interesting programs on campus. We've recently become the host for the Southern California Air Quality Management District. And this may not mean much to people outside of California, but this is one of the most powerful environmental agencies in the region for its involvement in controlling tailpipe emissions from cars, construction, and other air emissions, and balancing the needs between industry, residential, and clean air. So they're now a part of our campus. And finally, the river. The river is a dry river. It's called the Santa Ana River. It's not a wet environment river. It is the most litigated river in the world. It's only about 80 miles long, but it runs from the mountains down to Disneyland in Anaheim, California. And while it's not full of water, the aquifer that is below that river supplies water for upwards of 1 million people. And that it's a very essential part of this region, right? So that's where I am today. So I'd like to start by just saying, how did California become a green state? And I think it really begins with two factors. First of all, the state has a very unique geography and climate. It's exceptional in the United States, especially if you consider the history of American expansion from the East Coast, which is a wet climate where European ideas, common law, British common law, ideas about rivers and water were made sense. But as those settlers moved into this very dry Mediterranean climate, it brought up problems because our rivers don't work the same. And California is also host to some very severe climate events. And some of these are related to climate change, but some of these are natural cycles. But they're cycles that people coming from the eastern United States were not familiar with. For example, drought events due to El Nino that might last for 7 or 8 years. And what happens when settlers arrive in a wet cycle is that they take the rainfall for granted, and then we hit a dry cycle and everybody goes broke. So California has been a boom and bust society for quite a long time. So here's a map, and these I think are some of the most key environmental features of California related to the politics that have developed in the 20th century. So much of the water in the state is dependent on Sierra snowmelt. And Sierra snowmelt is brought by Pacific coast winds, depositing snow and forming glaciers at the top of our inland mountains. Those mountains in turn feed the rivers that provide water primarily to Northern California. And in Southern California, the main source of water, it's much more desert conditions, is the Colorado River. The Colorado River was dammed first with Hoover Dam, or Boulder Dam, just west of the Grand Canyon. That was the first major dam, and that dam provided electricity to Los Angeles, as well as regulating water in reservoirs. And since then, many other dams have gone up in the lower California. So what's interesting, I think, especially in Southern California with regards to the economy, is this relationship between water and deserts. And California agriculture began to boom only in the 20th century when water was brought in from very far away. And of course, El Nino that I mentioned is also very important at creating these unusual cycles of 4 or 5 years of uncharacteristically wet weather, as well as 4 or 5 years of uncharacteristically dry weather. And what we're seeing in the last century with global climate change is that those El Nino events are becoming more severe. The wets are becoming wetter and more flooding. The dries are stretching out longer. And that is further stressing different industries, agriculture, as well as urban development in California. So Mark Twain is alleged to have said, I haven't looked this up, I'm not a good historian on that, that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. And he's thinking of Western saloons, but I think it's very much true in California. Water is really the name of the game, especially in dry areas like Southern California. And here we see examples of development. This is a leg of the Southern Pacific Railroad running along the Salton Sea. The Salton Sea is a natural sink below sea level. And the Salton Sea fills when the Colorado River changes its course about once every 150 years. And it hadn't filled for a long time. They built this railroad. There was a period of intense rain with a wet El Nino event, and this area was flooded. We also see many examples of droughts where people move into an area failing to adapt to these long dry spells. And finally, in the 20th century, we have problems with the expansion of cities and urban development into wildlands. And we see natural cycles of forest fires that have always existed in California, especially in those dry seasons, that are now being impeded by human development. And we've seen our worst forest fires in 1,000 years in these last 2 years in California. So these cycles are a product of these wet and dry periods, but also of the incredible growth of urban infrastructure, this urban wildlands interface in the 20th century. So the 20th century brings water engineering, especially aqueducts, and this is one of the most famous, the LA aqueduct, that carries water over 200 miles from Sierra snowmelt on the eastern Sierra side across the Sierras down to Los Angeles. And this aqueduct was built in the very end of the 19th century, and it was a cause for lawsuits, went all the way up to the Supreme Court about stealing water from other river systems to bring into the city. And the city of LA, when they went to the Supreme Court, they made the weirdest argument you can imagine for Anglos from the East. And their argument was this: they cited traditional Mexican colonial Pueblo law and said that the Pueblo, or the town, had rights over frontier resources, even if they weren't part of that river system. And so they used Spanish colonial law to win the rights to build the city. Since then, in the 1950s and 60s, the state of California worked on another major project called the State Water Project. And this was to bring water from the wetter northern region several hundred miles to the southern region. And that's another major fixture. I don't know if anyone here has seen this old classic movie with Jack Nicholson called Chinatown. In my opinion, it's not my favorite movie, but I do show it to students to look at how water and the importance of water, how that is really central to a lot of political fights in California. And here you see farmland in the desert that's been sold because the owners know that irrigation systems are about to be extended to that region. So we see land going from being essentially worthless in this capitalist system to suddenly having real value if the water is essentially turned on. So in more recent history, one of the big events was a drought that happened in 1976, extreme drought over several years. And this prompted the then governor, Jerry Brown, on his first tour through California government to host conferences to draw attention to these issues. And people were listening all across California because they had never really experienced that kind of drought. And it just so happened that in the first decade of the 21st century, California entered another drought. This second drought was far more severe than the earlier drought cycle. our governor at the time, at the beginning of it, was Arnold Schwarzenegger. And Schwarzenegger, Republican, very uncharacteristically realized and advocated that California needed to engage in climate change mediation to try to slow down the effects, suffering for the drought. Schwarzenegger finished his term. Jerry Brown came into office, and it was Jerry Brown in 2016 that signed landmark legislation to commit the state of California to reducing carbon emissions below 1990 levels. And so we'll get to that. Brown also passed a new water bond, $7.5 billion, to basically continue this engineering project. He was recognizing that if the state doesn't prepare, he says it's what we must do to get through the drought and prepare for the next. We don't know how much our current problem derives from the buildup of heat trapping gases, but we can take this drought as a stark warning of things to come. So what's happened since then has been all manner of different campaigns across the state, sometimes pitting different water users against each other. For example, we've seen a focus on agriculture in the Central Valley with attempts to educate voters. And this is a sort of diagram of the major crops. And here we see that almonds consume quite a lot of the state's annual consumption, as well as alfalfa, which is a temperate climate grass that's used for cattle and livestock. But we've also seen a lot of lobbying. And if you see, we see ads like this, the uninformed blame it on almonds. The truth, it's livestock. Now, who's paying for this? veganstart.org, an almond producer. So here we see different industries trying to, in a sense, convince the voters that their use of water is ideal, and blame it on other people. We have a lot of that. So another aspect, of course, with California becoming a green state is understanding how much the state, especially Southern California, depends on transportation. Transportation, especially the internal combustion engine and the automobile, was fundamental to the state's growth, to be the 8th or 7th largest GDP in the world. And that really can't be overlooked. We talk about car culture in California, and car culture is maybe synonymous with movies, 1950s, hot rods, and sort of beautiful, glamorous people, a mid-century mystique. But I tell you, it is real. As a resident in Southern California, people here love their cars. And especially during the COVID pandemic, what we found is that people are shying away from mass transit. So this is a critical problem in a state that is so heavily dependent on automobiles and internal combustion engines. And that's really been the focus for government since the 1960s as a key to stopping emissions. And the car culture has become very politicized in California, especially during the last presidential cycle, even in a sense equating in some cases the car culture with the MAGA culture. We've seen car parades, and almost exclusively car parades before the last election with flags and this sort of thing. But I think it's important to remind everyone that cars have been essential to migration and immigration, whether it's during the Great Depression or across the southern border or interstate among our poorest citizens. Is really important to mobility and for people moving into the state. So what really raised people's attention about the problem of smog and car emissions and tailpipes? It was an event during World War II. July 26, Angelinos woke up to an eye-stinging, choking fog around the city. And almost immediately the radios were abuzz. They thought that Los Angeles had been attacked by Japan. That a Japanese gas attack had commenced. People weren't sure if it was safe to go outside. And scientists immediately, atmospheric scientists, began working on the problem. What they discovered was that a unique weather anomaly, an intense marine fog layer combined with heat and these heat domes, which really create stifling air in this basin that's surrounded by mountains, with tailpipe emissions. It was the smoke coming out of the motorcycles, the cars, and the refineries, and the factories working overtime during World War II that produced this eye-stinging toxic smog. And so what happened after that in the 1950s and 60s was a series of battles, really, between scientists, universities, and some of the largest industries in California. For example, oil and petroleum refineries very close to LAX, rail yards next to the ports of San Pedro and Long Beach. And you have scientists going up against city councils, which are obviously very susceptible to large political donations. But finally, in 1967, California establishes the first Air Resources Board in the United States. And they seek an exception from the federal government in the United States because of the severe environmental conditions and the unique geography of California to have a more stringent set of restrictions on tailpipes and mufflers in cars than anywhere else in the United States. And this is where California's standard emissions began. And until the Trump administration, until 2 years ago, nobody in the federal government had ever questioned this exception because everybody understood why it exists. And the California standard emissions had a very positive factor in forcing automotive industries, both in the United States and around the world, to raise their standards because they couldn't sell in the largest economy in the United States. And so this was key. And so, things like the smog check become common in California, where every 2 years, people driving older cars bring their cars in to make sure that these emissions, you have to pay for this. And newer policies, cap and trade policies, have come about to allow emitters to swap credits and to buy credits. And then those funds are used back to control emissions. And finally, in the last 15 years, energy has become a target of concern for greenhouse gas emissions. Fortunately, coal mining is not a big industry in California. California is very poor in coal. This is a Tesla mine, no relation to Elon Musk, no relation to Nikola Tesla, but I think it was made in honor of Nikola Tesla. And this is near Livermore in Northern California. Coincidentally, the mountains above here are one of the windiest passes in the world. This is where the Bay Area meets the Central Valley and is now the second largest wind farm. California is rich, however, in oil and natural gas. And it is these industries that have played a very big role in pollution emissions, but also in the politics, especially in the city of LA. And so Californians are very proud of the fact that they're not part of these coal mining debates the Trump administration has returned to. However, California is still the biggest consumer of Western coal-generated electricity. It's just that the coal mines are further inland in Utah, New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona. And so this is something that is, I think, important, and I'll get to this in my final comments, which is how does a sub-national unit like California become a global climate leader if its own economy is tied to a larger federal infrastructure with other states? And the coal mine is one example. California has, however, made strides, the government, in moving away from fossil fuels. It's one of the early pioneers. This is the San Gorgonio Pass, just east of Riverside, near Palm Springs. And that was one of the world's first wind farms. This is an image from long ago. Now this entire pass is covered with several thousand wind turbines. This is the Ivanpah solar plant near Las Vegas. California has also supported a lot of these developments, not just in the state, but also in its periphery and in Nevada. So very briefly, in the early 2000s, the California legislature, even under Republican Arnold Schwarzenegger, took very advanced views on creating more stringent regulations on greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles in 2002. And then finally, with the Democrats' creation of a supermajority in the California legislature, as well as Jerry Brown, followed by Gavin Newsom, have enacted some of the most ambitious climate legislation in the United States. When I last visited Tübingen, I was coming off of the inauguration of President Trump. I was very happy to spend time in Germany in the summer and fall of 2017, simply to get away from American headlines. But this was the big story. Governor Brown signing this legislation. The bill is called SB 32. And essentially what SB 32 does is force the state, the industry, the different industries, the energy producers, residential users, to commit to bringing greenhouse gas emissions up to 50% below 1990 levels in the next 20 to 30 years. And Brown, a former Jesuit, somebody who lives what he calls a very disciplined life, says this is going to require the coercive power of government. He doesn't pretend that this is going to be easy. And I think that that's, you know, an important note, because it gets to some of the conflicts that we see now. So some of the targets, the 2020 target was met. The 2020 target was to get California's total greenhouse gas emissions. As you see from this graph, they're mostly produced through transportation, industry, and electric power, below the 1990 levels through all kinds of different means: environmental justice, creating electric engines, electric vehicles. And our 2020 level, we're told, is at 425 million metric tons. So that's a good sign. There are all kinds of ideas: multi-sector coordination, science, universities, industries, government, all working together for these goals, to get the carbon emissions down, to create research plans, teams of individuals. But of course, the problem is, you know, sort of connecting science and advice to industry and government as who's going to pay for it. And that really hasn't been fully worked out. And it's a great idea, but there's another but. And this is the one I'd like to end on before turning it over to my colleague, Mika, which is that nobody in 2017 fully imagined the crisis that would develop between subnational and national leadership on climate change legislation. And as the governor of the United States' most heavily Democratic state, Gavin Newsom took a leading role after Jerry Brown in opposing some of President Trump's policies. In particular, President Trump was the first to say that California's exception, California standard emissions, will be revoked. And what's really interesting about this is the response that industry, the automotive industries, not just in the United States, but in Germany, Japan, all around the world, paid to this move. And at first, there was some fear about the Trump administration and how to relate to the Trump administration. But what happened was Governor Newsom, of course, very quickly said, no, we're going to fight this. His Attorney General, Javier Becerra, a Latinx man from Los Angeles area, took the fight to the courts. The courts defended California's right. Javier Becerra is now the senator replacing Kamala Harris from California. And his fight here, I think, had something to do with it. So there is a really big conflict that has emerged between California and the federal government of the United States. And these conflicts have to be resolved for subnational to subnational interaction around the world, I think, to be really effective. That's my opinion. So here's another example of that conflict. We had some of our worst wildfires in history. We've been using a word unprecedented every year for the last 5 or 6 years. This is an obvious sign that things are getting worse with regards to the climate. And in the follow-up to it, the Trump administration at first refused to grant emergency funds to fight the wildfires in California. President Trump said, it's California's fault. You should pay for it. Of course, a lot of people in the fire zones were Republicans. California does have very conservative and some far-right groups, especially in rural areas. And so Trump eventually reversed his idea. He made a visit out to the burn sites. This is one of those sites, and this is a month before the fall election. And what's really interesting is the speech that Gavin Newsom made at that public event. And I'll just read a little bit of it. Trump says some very inflammatory things. He says it's basically California's fault, that California doesn't manage its forests. And then Newsom, here you see him, sort of trying to make nice. We can agree to disagree, and I appreciate your frame on the politics of this, but let me just acknowledge 2 things briefly, and I'll turn it back to you. There's no question when you look past this decade and looking past almost 1,000 plus years that we have not done justice on our forest management. I don't think anyone disputes that. I want to acknowledge we have our US forest representative here. The state of California, your administration, just entered into a first of its type commitment over the next 20 years to double our vegetation management and forest management. But this is really the key thing. 57% of the land in this state is federal land. 3% is California land. So federal national forests are managed by the federal government. And so that is really the big problem for subnational leadership on this issue in terms of wildfires. And so I'll conclude with a segue. And I think one of the big takeaways over the last 3 years in California with regards to subnational leadership has been this conflict with the federal government. We have problems as well with multi-sector collaboration. For example, the automotive industry. Should automotive industries respond at the federal level or at this exceptional state level? Fortunately, they've all, since Trump lost the election, come back to say, yes, yes, California, we're going to work at your standards because it helps us sell cars around the world. Land management is big. And finally, an area that I think many people may not have considered a problem are tax codes. And we see this with news like big money firms abandoning California. Tesla, Elon Musk, recently, most famously, has decided to leave his residency in California and move to Texas. And what we see here is that the federal government, by tweaking the tax code, can exert real economic suffering on states that have different tax codes. And the state of California's tax code includes an income tax. And that income tax is used in part to fight global climate change. And so the federal rule, and Trump and his supporters knew this, what they did was to eliminate what's called the state income tax exception, which means that people don't have to pay double tax when they pay their federal taxes. But by removing that, it allows states that don't charge income tax, Florida and Texas, for example, to lure some of this wealth and some of these biggest companies away. So these kinds of differences, these financial differences, and the role that federal governments play in them are really important for the future of this subnational leadership. So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to my colleague, Tobias.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Um,
Yes.
no, I need to write that. Okay, sure. So thank you very much for for inviting me to this session and for the opportunity to present the story of our astonishing cooperation with California in the fight of climate change. My talk will have two parts. One is I will highlight again the Under2 coalition, even though you might have heard back in 2012 to 2017, the first part of it, but that's why I keep that short. And then second is our newest level of partnership with a partnership MOU that we signed just recently. And one further remark on my charts, of course, you will see that that Californian professors are so much better in presentations than German civil servants. So I'm just going to offer you some words. So here we are, the Under2 coalition. The Under2 coalition started back in May 2015. That is, more precisely, the idea came up during a meeting that my boss, Minister Untersteller, had with Governor Jerry Brown in 2014. And we draw up the MOU, and it was then signed in May 2015. That was initiated by California and Baden-Württemberg, but then this first signing ceremony was then joined by 10 other members, 10 other member regions. And the idea at the start was to show and to really add to the preparations of the UN climate conference in Paris, and to give him an extra push. And it seemed in the year 2015 that it was the right thing to do at the right time, because right at the conference in December 2015, we had then over 100 regions that had signed the MOU. Now we have more than 220 governments that add up to 1.3 billion people and 33% of global economy. And the Under2 coalition is found all over the world. And it's still the Under2, because what does that mean? It's the goal is written down in the Memorandum of Understanding that we fight to keep global temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius. Or another Under2 is that our CO2 emissions per person stay under 2 tons. So we're still quite far away from that. Now, it started with an MOU, which is just a piece of paper that you sign. And now you have 220 governments. And of course, even though it wasn't the original intention, it turned out in these 5 years that now we are having an international organization. And of course, the ministry of my team and our colleagues in California, we weren't able to handle an international organization next to our normal work. so we asked the Climate Group, which is an NGO based in London, to play the part of the secretariat of this Under2 coalition, and they now doing the main job and work with the governments on 3 work streams that I'm going to present now. Now here's a first look, again a short look on the world and where we're all in. It's the blue parts, they are all members. The green parts, these are national governments that play a role as endorsers, because our members are, as it was already mentioned, subnational level. That is federal states, Bundesländer, regions, provinces, however you name that institution, that entity. But in the very beginning, a state like Luxembourg asked us, they wanted to join. And now we didn't want to have a mixture of levels to make the message, to keep it clear. So we said, yes, you can, of course, help us and become an endorser. So national governments like France, the Federal Republic of Germany, or Canada and Mexico have become endorsers. And then you see several dots. These are big cities that have become members. And of course, we accepted them because the first was an association of cities from China. And we were so happy to have Chinese participants in climate action. So we accepted these association of cities. Now regions like Jiangsu have joined us as full partners. Okay, now let's come to the work streams. Here I'd like to highlight first the Future Fund. So we have a little money given to us from Scotland, Wales, Quebec, and other regions where we help developing countries in funding and try to support them, their climate activities. Originally, it was meant to help them finance the travel costs to the COP conferences and to our own conferences and events that we organize. But now during the pandemic, there are no travel costs, so we changed that and help them in setting up other policies like policy action or helping them in their transparency goals. Transparency is a very important issue in climate change because you actually need to know how the greenhouse gas emissions are evolving, how they are developing, and if your measures are really worthwhile, if they have the positive effect that you are waiting for. Apart from all these measures that have more symbolic background. One of the things that that is policy action projects is the methane project, which is a forum of state and regional governments. The latest action we did was, of course, you might know that the European Union started a methane strategy, and we tried to help them and applaud this strategy by writing letters from California, from Baden-Württemberg, and a third letter from our secretariat. We'll see how much the Brussels, the Commissioner Timmermans will be impressed by receiving these letters from us. Then there are these, as I said, these transparency projects, which are very important. First, from the very beginning, we have this annual disclosures. That is, regions give their data on their emissions to the climate group, and they set up an annual report on that and give so they give a global picture of impact, progress, and climate action by all most of the member states. They do that in partnership with the CDP, which is the Carbon Disclosure Project, another NGO based again in London. This is really about the important MRV thing, so measuring, reporting, and validating. This is a vital point that the United Nations would also like to have on the national field, or international field, so that nations should report their emissions, which, well, you can imagine transparency is not highlighted in all nations around the world. Some even despise it. So the thing we did as regions back in 2015, we simply said, well, we don't have anything to hide. We simply do that and just collect the data we have. And so you have already these reports over the year where you see the climate action and the effect that the policies of the subnational level can have worldwide. So this measuring, reporting, and validating is very important. And it's nicely added by the Climate Footprint Project, which is one of the, it's about the biggest project that we have right now. It's financed by the German Federal Ministry of Environment with several million, I think 4 million euros. And it is really about how we can create the tools and measures for states that want to be part of that and don't have the means, especially in developing regions. So regions in Mexico, in Brazil, in India, and South Africa are part of this project. And of course, you can imagine when a region like the state of Sao Paulo, which is much bigger than most of the European states, is giving its reporting its data, you really know what the impact of policy making in Sao Paulo is. So the next part is our bilateral MOU with California where we try to establish a partnership. I'm a bit reluctant. I come back to that. So here you have a number of fields of interest, and the important thing is, of course, that on first, the first field of interest is climate, energy, and environment. Of course, there are other interests like economic interests as well, and of course, we know that science and research areas and institutions have a very long tradition of partnership and cooperation. But for this MOU and for this partnership, climate change and the exchange of ideas in climate and energy is the main focus. So here you have a list of what we actually do. And of course, it's mainly exchange of experience and information, exchange of experts that could have happened because of the pandemic, of course, but we get back to that as soon as the virus is gone, and job sharing. And we are working on projects, as I said, like the methane thing. This is really what we do and what the idea about this partnership is. Very important, and I say that as a lawyer, very important for the partnership, and very important for our foreign office in Berlin to allow us to sign this partnership was the provision 3. So none of the provisions contained in this memorandum should entail any legally binding or financial obligations for any one of the partners. So this is really the thing, because it's also is the important part for the MOU that is the basis of the Under2 coalition. There is nothing legally binding. It's just, yeah, your own will and the binding of your own wish and will that keeps us all together. What is the basis of such a partnership? Well, good manners and decency, which is so much questioned and at stake right now. What are the challenges that we face? Same with the Under2 coalition as with the partnership, is firstly the question we very often meet: who are you? I mean, who is the subnational level? There are no really specific ideas about this. What is this? Everybody knows what a nation is, and everybody knows what a local community is. Everybody knows a village or a city with a mayor and a council and what they do. But the subnational level is rather abstract, and it's very diverse, and it very depends on the willingness of the federal level to allow them doing its own thing and its own action. So once I was asked, well, Baden-Württemberg, is that just folklore, or do you really have something to say? Of course, when you point at California, there's no question that this is a big thing. Now, Baden-Württemberg, you really need to explain that. And same with all the other subnational entities that I mentioned. Then that adds to the second point, the public awareness. It really is a difficult story to tell. You can't cut it really short for journalists to digest. What is this Under2 coalition? What's it all about? And what do you really do? What does the subnational, what do these regions do? What is their power? What are their possibilities? Another challenge is discontinuity. This is, you'll find that in the United States. it's not so common in Germany. Here we have a saying that governments may come and go, but administration stays on. Now, in other countries, it's the same for Eastern European and Southeastern European countries. There is this discontinuity that one government and administration leaves the place empty for the next to come in. So you have to get all of your connections set up again, and then yeah, you ring the bell and say, well, did you know we were partners? Do you know you're a member of the Under2 coalition? And then there comes the question, but who are you? And what does all that mean? And of course, financial resources, as almost all NGOs, all organizations, of course, we too lack of financial resources. So if any in the audience should have any idea how we fill that gap, we'll be open to any contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David Biggs and Tobias Eisele, for your talks. And I would say now it's time to get some questions to you both. So maybe I can start. I have prepared some questions. Maybe we get some more questions from our viewers. And I just want to ask you right away, where do we stand? Is there any real chance to reach the goal of cutting the emissions by 2050? What do you think?
How to say? It's almost as simple to answer as when will the pandemic end? Because, as I said, some of the action we take, some of the measures you take, it's difficult to calculate beforehand what the effect on the emissions will be. Now we have reversed our Climate Protection Act and have added some ideas we got from our Californian friends. We simply don't know what effect this will have on the CO2 emissions. If we have now an obligation to set up PV solar systems on all rooftops on commercial buildings, we simply don't know. You can't figure that out precisely.
And you said from a piece of paper to an international organization, and that a London-based company is doing the main job now. And in the beginning, 2015, it was California and Baden-Württemberg who started this whole memorandum of understanding. And is there still today? And if so, what special connection in regard to climate fight is between California and Baden-Württemberg? Are they still working closely together, or was it just this main kickoff event of the memorandum of understanding?
Well, we're working closely together. As I said, we just had this methane initiative where we joined forces and wrote letters to the Commission in Brussels to tell them how happy we are about their methane strategy. But as I said, we had with the end of the administration of Jerry Brown and the new governor, we had some difficult months to go through and to come up again and explain ourselves. Well, we for Baden-Württemberg, did you know we are friends and we have a partnership? So some of the colleagues that entered the administration in Sacramento, of course, they couldn't know. How should they know? But that was at the beginning a bit of some difficult days and weeks.
If I may add just a little bit of more of a cultural observation in California, the responses and the positive steps to limiting emissions in California seem to almost always be driven by a disaster of epic proportions, and B, a story that manages to capture the sentiments of voters. And I'll give you an example. The ports of San Pedro and LA have long been associated with the worst emissions of particulates, of toxic substances, and but the companies, BNSF Railway, the ports themselves, the city governments, have all been very reluctant to change rules about diesel emissions. And what happened about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, was that some scientists began working with local community groups. These are particularly communities of color through 50 plus years of discrimination policies and bank loans for houses have effectively forced communities of colors to live around these industrial areas. And the former executive of the South Coast Air Quality Management District, he was eventually actually forced out by these petroleum refinery interests. But he worked with journalists to come up with a story, and the story was called Diesel Death Zones. And they made this story to convince the members of the LA City Council that they needed to restrict, and to convince the companies that they needed to cut their emissions and move to all electric. Without that story, without the pressure campaign, it's unlikely that the railroad, the trucking companies would have come to the table. And so I think one lesson that we learned in California is that the story, the narrative is so important to convince people. If there's a story they can grab onto and empathize with and understand the impacts, then that helps.
I have one thing I want to dwell on this, on the Under2 coalition. What we already, Mr. Eisele and me, we had a little chat before the talk, and you said one problem is that most of the memorandum is aiming to subnational levels. So that mostly the connections are on a subnational level. Why is that focus mostly on a subnational level? And why is it not possible to embed more states or countries?
Well, we simply don't want them because it would blur the story. As David just said, storytelling is very important. There are other innumerous organizations of cities. There's the C40, for instance. And of course, the nations don't need any organized special organization because they have the COB. I mean, they're members of the climate change initiative. But what was lacking at the time was really an organization, a tool to make that all the efforts done by the states and regions and provinces in climate change, where you should showcase that, and that's the main thing why we have it and why we still need it.
If I can add to it too, I think that the subnational organization allows for a very important kind of pressure on national governments. We see it here with our forests, with forests that are dying from beetles that are killing them. And that is clearly associated with climate change. The lack of a cold spell doesn't kill off these insects, and we're seeing our forests die, which then lead to these massive forest fires. I bring forest specialists into my classes, and we've talked quite a lot about it. And what they say is that it's the restriction on federal land that you can't quickly change these policies about how to remove the trees, whether to, other kinds of strategies that would be very quick if they were locally controlled, you could do. And so one of the important factors that I see, especially in terms of state level leadership in the United States, is to shine a highlight. And that's why that news conference was very important between Newsom and Trump. It's really forcing this issue about flexibility at the subnational level.
One question we have from the audience is, will Germany and the USA get China, Russia, and India also on the train to zero emissions? Or will it be hard to get these countries in any kind of contract sooner or later?
Yeah, well, China is really on track. Of course, they won't reach the goal of zero emissions by 2050, but they have seen the fact that they have to fight climate change as well. Now, there's one thing that that emissions are a wonderful democratic thing. Even head of state has to breathe the same air as any other citizen. So when the air is bad in Beijing, everybody is affected, and so even the highest politicians see it on their and their own lungs, what the effect of pollution is. And same with climate change. Everybody is affected. So it really is a very democratic issue. You can't hide, and you can't get to some remote village and live a high class life. And it seems to be a similar thing in India, whereas decision making in India, I'm not an expert for India, but it seems to be a difficult thing. You don't get quick answers from Indian governments. But of course, we also have members from India, Indian regions, Indian states that are member, and they want to do things and also be part of our climate change initiative.
And we have one further question. What kind of concrete California-Baden-Württemberg partnership has this MOU helped to foster? Like a concrete examples. Do you have any specific examples that have been particularly successful?
Not yet.
And one question that would interest me to David Biggs, maybe. In November this year, the world leaders are going to be gathering in Glasgow for the successor of the landmark's Paris meeting from 2015. And Joe Biden wants to rejoin the Paris Climate Treaty on day one, as he said. What do you think? Will the Biden-Harris administration will be able to gain on some speed in regard to improve climate change measures?
I think so. I mean, I'm like everyone, a spectator, maybe a little closer to it in the States than you are in Baden-Württemberg. But one great sign, even despite all of the Trump administration's overtures to the coal industry, is that coal industry production and energy generation has dropped precipitously in the last 4 years. And I think that what we are seeing in a lot of industries, and especially in the logistics and transport industry. And this has become so highlighted during the pandemic with Amazon planes circling our cities every day, is really the importance of transportation commitments to emissions. And we saw it in the battles in the courts over the California standard emissions. And those emissions are also becoming more strict. And automotive producers are saying, we're going with that. We're not going to waste our time with a showboater president who wants to go back to the 19th century. We have to go forward. I think it's, with every disaster, every forest fire, every drought that happens year after year, the voters and the publics, both in California and across the country, are, regardless of their political views, are increasingly moving to a position of supporting these initiatives. So I think that, I hope history will show that Trump and his Republican followers were anachronistic. They were out of step with the times, and that it won't be an issue in 4 years or 8 years. I think that we're getting there. I think we're getting there in our very divisive politics here. So I hope so. And I think that also the promotion of California figures under Vice President Kamala Harris and the new Senator Javier Becerra, these are great signs, at least at the beginning of Biden's administration. So I can say for at least, most of my friends and everyone I hear from, including my conservative friends, we've just got our fingers crossed to January 21st. We're just hoping to get to January 21st peacefully and in one piece. Yeah.
I've just read a few days ago in the Washington Post on January 6th, the Trump administration has held the first sale for rights to drill for oil in Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but obviously it drew not much interest. Major companies, including ExxonMobil, Shell, and BP, have said they are focusing their spending on renewable energy, which is quite interesting. And my question would be, besides the Economic America First policies of the Trump administration, do you think that there is a significant shift in climate thinking throughout the US as well as in Germany already?
I can't speak for Germany, but I can speak for these American companies. I know that their advertising campaigns, but also their investments, their portfolios are shifting. And I think that has to do with the American military and its planning for future climate scenarios for industrial consumers of energy. And the future in the next 20 or 30 years, I think these companies are betting to make more money on renewables. It's not out of any real deep ethical concern for humanity, I'm afraid. But it is a good sign. And it's interesting too to hear the chatter on the radio and in other circles about companies leaving California, like Elon Musk. And what a lot of people are saying are two things. One thing, people in the Bay Area are saying, thank God, because you can't afford to buy a house in the Bay Area. Apple, for example, and these other tech companies have been horrible to their communities. They've been horrible to mass transit. They've been horrible to many of their contract workers. And so a lot of people in the Bay Area say, thank God, let Texas take them. But the other effect is political. And we saw that in the Georgia Senate runoff, in which so many people are moving from other places to these states that have historically had majorities opposed to these climate initiatives. And this will happen in Texas. It will happen in 4 years or 8 years, but it is going to happen that as more businesses and more people who are responsive to national and international affairs move to these states, they're going to shift the politics at that subnational level. So I think there's a lot of room for optimism. But as far as the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, I think that's a good example of companies hedging their bets. Trump's already lost the election, they know that if they set foot there and start drilling, the new administration's going to come down hard on them. So I think that is what we're seeing.
And one last question, maybe in the direction of Mr. Eisele. Are you trying to convince other subnational regions to participate in the memorandum, or do other subnational regions approach you and want to be part of the agreement themselves?
Yeah, we're rather in a position where we can wait and they come and want to be part of it. And as I said, the coalition is really not binding, and we want to have members that are really active. So they should be active from the very first step and take the initiative and approach us and ask, can we sign the MOU? So that would be the first thing of showing activity. Otherwise, yes, we are unhappy with members that after the signing of the MOU never showed up.
So that happens.
Yes, yes, of course. And as I said, this is one of the problems is the discontinuity, that you have a willing and very active administration, then the government changes, and then it turns down to zero.
And you just mentioned that there is a slight funding problem with the whole organization, that it's not easy to get enough funding together to keep on supporting the whole initiative.
It's no problem getting funding for projects when you have concrete projects, but the funding of the daily work of the organization, this basic funding, that is difficult to get, because of course it's a very boring thing. You can't highlight it anywhere, you can't tell anybody, nobody will be impressed by that. Well, it doesn't change any emissions. Yeah, that's the problem. But again, we haven't found an intelligent story to tell to make that possible.
I think if I can add on that, I think that is an interesting, place to end in terms of the story. We tend to underestimate stories because we focus on money or law or power, but stories have incredible power. And I'll just share one little piece that I talk to my students in my 20th century world history class, and we look at the incredible changes. And I make the case that a scientist, Rachel Carson, is one of the most powerful figures in catalyzing the environmental movement, not because she was a scientist, but because of her ability to write and tell stories that resonated with people all around the world from different classes. And so I think that work is very important and still remains to be done.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to both of you, to David Biggs and to Tobias Eisele, for joining us tonight. I think it's a nice point to. We could go on for hours, I suppose, about this topic, but thank you so much for the input. Thank you to our audience for participating. You will find the whole talk online on YouTube later. So if you want to do a recap or send it to friends, please feel free to do so. This was the second part of our series, Eureka, Ländle meets California. Thank you to the German American Center in Stuttgart and to the Ministry of State of Baden-Württemberg for supporting us. Thank you to all of you. And I say bye-bye and have a lovely night and see you soon at our events. Thanks.
Good night.
Thank you very much.